let me start with my own question, and I'll take two other questions. Commissioner, you were saying that you're not going to backtrack from, or you should not backtrack from, the Copenhagen Accord. Of course, there is kind of one contradiction where I do not see how you cannot backtrack on one of them. It's, on the one hand, the pledges. There have been enough studies in the meantime to know that the pledges are actually not delivering the 2 degrees. So it's either you will have to backtrack on the 2 degrees, or you will have to actually increase the pledges, or to actually improve the pledges. If you accept that you stay with these pledges that are there now, then you're backtracking on the 2 degrees. So how can you solve this contradiction? That's my question. But can I now see some show of hands of people who want to come in? I'll start here in front, and I'll go in the back then.
My name is Lucy Robson. I'm from the Cyprus Weekly newspaper. You mentioned that you think that economies and sectors and businesses which best understand how to adapt to climate change action will profit the best in the long term. Do you have any sectors or economies in mind?
Okay. Which sectors? Yeah. Let's the gentleman first, and then the lady again. Let's keep the gender balance.
Tamás Foti from the Hungary News Agency. Let me tell you first that in Hungary we had a terrible cold summer, but it doesn't mean that diminishing the enthusiasm. I'd like to know how keen you are watching the forthcoming elections in the US, and if it's coming from your point of view positively, then what's your expectations from the US?
Thank you very much.
Laura Pascas, I'm a freelance journalist from the United States, and sort of a follow-up on that, we've heard a lot about the loss of trust after Copenhagen, and I'm just curious what you're anticipating from the United States, and how, if what happens in Copenhagen happens again, how you plan on dealing with that.
Okay. Commissioner, I'll let you respond to those first
Thank you. How not to backtrack if we can agree, I mean, that's just a mathematical fact, that the pledges given in the annex to the Copenhagen Accord is not enough to stay below the 2 degrees. I think that you can still say that sort of the lowest common denominator is the Copenhagen Accord, with whatever was pledged in the annexes. And then after having cashed in the Copenhagen Accord, so to speak, in the formal negotiations, because that's not where they are now, cash that into the formal text. Then after that, of course, you can work on improving the targets. I take that that will be an easier discussion the day the American Senate might have passed American legislation. It's difficult to take it now. But just to say that I see no contradiction. Now it's about cashing in whatever was there, also where it's not good enough. Then that is the common ground on which we stand, and that is what we should build from. The other scenario is that people start to say, oh, should it be 2 degrees? Maybe it should be something else. Should it be 100 billion by 2020? Maybe it should be something else. And my fear with that scenario would be that some would start to lose sort of their patience with the whole process if they sort of see that whatever was achieved in Copenhagen is now being the big discussion platform for Cancun as well. Then I think that also citizens would sort of perceive it as backtracking.
US elections?
Sorry?
On the US elections?
Yeah, if I can take it just for you were asking about sectors and economies, which would I have in mind that would prosper. I think that's many, many different sectors. Just let me give a few examples. One thing that is for sure when we exit this economic crisis is that energy prices will increase significantly. If we take what the International Energy Agency says, there is no doubt that, for instance, 5 years from now, we will have significantly enhanced oil prices. We will have significantly increases in lots of fossil fuels. So I would argue that if you are, for instance, a cement producer, and you can develop technologies where you are more energy efficient than your competitors, then you will sort of earn at the bottom line. I just this morning met with a cement producer, a very big cement producer, who have found a new technology where they can save 25% of the energy input without changing the machinery. They do not have to do a lot of new investments in machinery. That's the kind of innovation that we need. I think that one thing is in industry, but I also think that as societies, for instance, take Europe, if we do much more in the field of energy efficiency, we will gain from it as societies. We would have to spend less money on imported fossil fuels, gas from Russia, oil from the Middle East. That would also benefit our economies, and that was part of the communication from the Commission back in May, where we tried to sort of also in the background papers, you can find a lot of examples there. On the US elections, what can happen? Now I'm not sort of, I mean, I can, as little as you can, predict exactly what is going to happen. But I think that there is naturally a big challenge if the Tea Parties, who have sort of asked their candidates to be against two things, climate change and gay marriage, I understand. That's a precondition. Of course, there is a challenge there if these kind of movements will be stronger than they are today in the United States. That will make things more difficult. Personally, I think, and that is maybe a bit related also to the other question, I believe that many in the US, in Europe, in other places, when they see the next 5-year plan of China, I believe that we will have some kind of change in the discussion. Because right now, for instance, the American discussion is very much, oh, if we are too ambitious here, then we will lose jobs. And that is true if you do it very stupidly. If you are ambitious in a very stupid way, then of course you can lose jobs. Now I think that so far in Europe we have managed to do it in a rather intelligent way. And we have compensated the very climate leakage, carbon leakage exposed sectors. But I believe that when we see the next Chinese 5-year plan, that many will start to realize that they might be very slow around the negotiation table, but they're actually doing a lot of things in reality. So that is where I think that it will dawn on many people, yes, you can lose jobs if you're too ambitious and doing it unintelligently, but you can also losing jobs if you are not moving in this field, if you are getting too complacent, if you're not innovating enough. There are many ways of losing jobs, not just one way. And then you asked about loss of trust. You know, I think that what I've learned is also that trust is a very, very political thing. I think that up to Copenhagen and since Copenhagen, a lot of efforts have been put into increasing trust, build trust, bring ministers in to a very different degree than what used to be the case. Ministers getting to know each other, building up trust and confidence. In the end, if people do not want to agree on something, you can always sort of say, oh, it's lack of trust. I think that it was very transparent up to Copenhagen. I think the incoming Mexican presidency have done whatever they can to secure very big transparency. And I think what we need now, it's not so much, I mean, of course, trust is very important, but now it's also political will. Also, sometimes when you cannot have it 100% the way you would like to see it, that you have sort of the will to sort of go towards the other person, the other party, and then find a reasonable compromise. That's what we need now.
Thank you, Commissioner. Second round of questions, and I'll start in the back and I'll come up here.
Eddie Oswald from Salmon Star.
Sir, would you say your name
Try
and
to speak up a bit, please.
My name is Eddie Oswald from Salmon Star in Salmon Island. I'm just interested in how much the small island state get from the 7.2 billion US dollars you mentioned, including Solomon Islands. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Yeah, we come up in front here, yeah.
Eric Struy from El Comercio from Peru. Does the European Union still expect to recover the initiative lost in Copenhagen? I'm asking this because you are flying to Cancun with a 20% target, which is less ambitious than the original 20% target, given the consequences of the recession. It is a target that is much more easy to achieve, I mean.
Okay, thank you very much. Next question there.
Ecology and Life, Russia. Which decisions do you expect from Cancun? So, that's it.
Okay.
So what did you say, which positions?
Which decisions?
Which decisions? do you
decisions?
expect?
I think the Commissioner already mentioned that in a way, but I mean, she can come back to that. If I may, because we had a Russian speaker, there's one question that I would like to add on, because you were talking about the AAUs being a problem there. If you, of course, take them out of the whole Kyoto architecture, you will need to compensate Russia in some way. How could that be done?
First, which decisions do I respect for Cancun? I understand your question, because that's what I would like to see from Cancun. And now you're asking, what do you think actually comes out of Cancun? And that I cannot really answer, because it depends on the political will. If the political will is there, I think that we could make a balanced package. We could secure momentum. We could pave the way forward towards South Africa. If the political will is not there, as I said, I would fear very much if we only progress a little, or even not progress at all, then I would fear really for the whole process. So I think it's absolutely crucial, and I can only encourage everybody to sort of contribute to a result being done in Cancun. On the AAUs, how to sort of compensate, it's a very, very tricky question, as of course you know. We will sort of internally in the European Union have to look at this, but for instance with the 8 billion tons of hot air, I think that it is difficult to see if we just, I mean, what is it? It is basically emissions that have never been emitted, sort of some surplus emissions, and I know that it is a resource to some, but I also think that if you're setting targets for yourself, as for instance Russia has done, and just continues this, then in reality it will bring us nowhere if we are just trading hot air with one another. So I'm not going into this compensation question, because, I mean, if it was in the provisions that you cannot sort of use this hot air, then the value of the hot air, of course, would be rather limited, and there is not necessarily compensation to be done, but that is up to the negotiations. It's just to say 11 billion tons, I tried to give you the proportion, that more or less corresponds to all the efforts we would do in Europe up to 2020. If we just did all that by buying hot air, then everybody can see that the net result would not be very beneficial to the environment. You were asking, so down there, about how much the small island states could expect. I cannot sort of put a specific figure on that, but I can say that in the Commission contribution will be 50% for adaptation and 50% for mitigation. And one of the things we had in the Copenhagen Accord was that the adaptation money should be targeted particularly at the most vulnerable and least developed countries. And that is very important. So that is also there. We try also with our member states to take care that there is a reasonable balance between mitigation activities, REDD+ forestry activities, and adaptation activities. And of course it's very important that the least developed countries and the most vulnerable will get a significant part of the adaptation money, and that will be so also for the European money. And then finally, the gentleman from Peru asked whether does EU try to recover the initiative after Copenhagen. I'm sorry, but I have to correct one of the things you said, because it sounded as if you said that we do not still have 30% on the table. That's not true. We will come to Cancun with exactly the same position as we had in Copenhagen. 20% unilaterally, already effort shared and burden shared and whatever with all 27 member states. They're already doing the plans, not only 20% CO2 emissions cuts, but also 20% renewables. And we get reports, you know, regularly exactly how is this progressing in each member state. And we said in Copenhagen we would be willing to go to 30% provided others contribute, and that is also still at the table for Cancun. The discussion we have in Europe on the 20 and 30% That is not on this, because everybody agrees we stick to our pledges. If the rest of the world would move forward and the United States and others would sort of commit, then we could also go to the 30%. Now the problem is, if we do not get progress internationally, then we have the discussion internally in Europe. What would we do? Would we stand still at the 20, or should we be more ambitious? But that is more like a domestic discussion. There is no question that our offer since 2 years back, that we could go to 30%, provided others did comparable things, that is still at the table.
Okay, thank you very much. Let's go for our next round. Yeah, I'll come to you later. Let's go up here.
Franco Foresta Martin from Geo and Geo Italian Television. I was in New York about 9 years ago when Ambassador Kenneth Brill, speaking at the name of President Bush, announced that Kyoto Protocol is dead. And I remember that the European Commissioner answered, no, is well alive. Now, I don't want to make all the story, but we know that it survived. And it seems again in a sort of deep agony. Do you really think that Kyoto Protocol will survive to 2012, even in a form of a Kyoto II legally binding agreement?
Okay, thank you very much. Let's come up a bit more here in front. Yeah, we go back to the back here now. First in front. The lady here and then the Le Monde.
Oana Dan from Romania. I have one short question. The situation inside the EU is not very, very balanced. How do you push new members like Romania and Bulgaria forward in taking action themselves, taking into account the fact that they are lagging behind in so many fields in environment? Thank you.
Thank you very much. And the Le Monde journalist now.
Hello, I'm Grégoire Alix, Le Monde. You constantly refer to Copenhagen Accord, of course, and you say we have to build, the parties have to build on this accord. But after Copenhagen, a lot of countries, among which poorest countries in Africa and so-called Bolivarian countries in South America, said Copenhagen Accord was not a good accord. It was a rich country-minded text, to resume. How do you think you can take them into the process and try to make them really, to associate them? Because I think maybe the lack of progress of this year on the second track of negotiation and the opposition that some poorest countries showed trying to dismantle the Copenhagen Accord maybe comes from this problem that it is an accord negotiated among rich countries.
Okay, thank you very much. Commissioner?
To take the last one first, I think that with all due respect, I think that had we had new signals this year from, say, key players like China, United States, others, then I think that other things could have been solved as well. Just to say that I'm not sure that it's sort of the problem with the poorest countries that is sort of the reason why we have not had progress this year. I mean, if the American Senate had passed legislation, as many of us had hoped before a summer recess, then we would have been in another situation now. Now it has been easier for us sort of to hide behind the back of the United States, the lack of progress there. I think that the picture was much more sort of diverse in Copenhagen. Some of the countries who were key players in constructing the Copenhagen Accord definitely were poor developing countries. Some of the key actors in Melissenavis, for instance, President Nasheed from the Maldives and others. There were many there and they were all in that room. So we have more around these 140 countries saying this is what we accept. Others have said we did not like the process, which I think we can all understand. And then they have some more procedural reasons why they did not sort of subscribe to it, but basically they would not be that much against what is in it. And then there are probably some few that would still say we do not like. We would like to see, for instance, higher targets for the 100 billion long-term finance. But if I could just comment on that. I understand very well that if you're a poor developing country, then you would, of course, say, is 100 billion enough for 2020? I just think that to get 100 billion US dollars each year on top of what is already ODA from 2020 and onwards, I mean, if we really could achieve that globally, that would be a major step forward. Personally, I think that there is no way this could happen only through public sources. It would be a combination of innovative mechanisms, carbon markets, you know, some kind of private investments. It would have to come from a variety of sources. But although you can discuss about even higher figures, I think that if we could really come up with a financial architecture, making it likely that from 2020, we actually had an extra $100 billion delivered per year, it would be a major step forward. How to push Romania, Bulgaria, others you mentioned forward. I must say that now I'm traveling around in the EU, 27 member states, and I get the feeling that it's not sort of, here we have sort of the old member states and here we have the new member states. It's a much more diverse picture. And I think that in also many of the new member states, governments are trying to harvest a lot of energy efficiency things. As things are being changed, for instance, in Bulgaria, they are starting to incinerate waste, for instance. They have to live up to a lot of environment legislation as part of being part of Europe, and so on and so forth. So I just think that it's not sort of a very black-white picture. I went to Romania this spring, and I know that also in Romania, people are starting to make renewable projects and things like that. So it's not that it's stagnation. I definitely see movement. And also, if you look at the effort sharing and the percentages giving out, all countries will have to take part in this effort for years to come. So I think that the picture is being changed at the European level. And then finally, as the question was put, do you really think that the Kyoto Protocol will survive to 2012? I think it will survive to 2012. Will it survive after 2012? That's the big question. Nobody can answer that. I said very clearly before what is sort of the EU position. We have no problem with the Kyoto Protocol to continue. We know that others have, as a very sort of outstanding American politician once said to me when I mentioned the Kyoto Protocol, she said, don't even mention the K word. I mean, we cannot just mention the K word. And I believe that no matter what we call it, what is at stake is, can we agree on an internationally binding framework? Some would argue, maybe it doesn't matter. Maybe we can just make the market come forward with their solutions. I will just say, the European experience is that when you set targets, binding targets, there is much better likelihood for that you actually move in that direction. That your priorities do not suddenly get something different because then you have a crisis or suddenly you are distracted by some other challenge coming up. Take my own country, Denmark, where I was minister until last year. I mean, I would argue, had it not been for our binding Kyoto target, in Denmark they will have to reduce 21% compared to 90% before 2012. Had it not been for that binding commitment, I would argue that the big transport investment plan for the next 12 years that was done 2 years back would not have turned around 180 degrees the relation between investing in public transport and roads. It was turned very much in favor of public transport. I would also argue that had it not been for that binding target, we would not have made a big initiative called Green Growth for Agriculture, trying to find out how can agriculture contribute to reducing emissions. Just to say that when you have targets, well, you have the predictability for business. They know where they are going. They know that they need innovation. The political attention and focus will be there, and things will sort of move forward quicker than would else have been the case. And as the time factor matters, according to science, I think that we should not give up sort of the attempt to try to see if we can create an international framework. It's difficult, yes. There is lots of risks in this. I see that. But sometimes when I get a bit sort of depressed, say, oh, my goodness, how slow this is moving, then I think 5 years back. If you think 5 years back, where was this discussion 5 years ago? The whole world was not discussing energy efficiency. Business were not sort of making their plans as to how they can have much higher, better resource efficiency, and so on and so forth. There was so much of the discussion that we didn't have 5 years ago. So sometimes also when you step one step back, you can see the long trend, and there I think that we basically have done quite some progress in recent years.
Thank you very much, Commissioner. We go to our American colleague here, and then I'll come back in the back there. Yeah. First, our American colleague here.
Liam Moriarty, National Public Radio in the U.S. There was such a build-up and such expectations built up before Copenhagen, and perhaps a part of what Laurence Graff referred to yesterday as the Copenhagen trauma resulted from the buildup of expectations and the failure to materialize those expectations. Going into Cancun, you and other EU officials who've been with us this weekend are being careful to kind of downplay too much to be expected. How much of that is a realistic assessment of what is doable, and how much of that is perhaps an effort to try to manage expectations to avoid the kind of snapback that happened when Copenhagen unfolded the way it did?
Okay, thank you. The gentleman 2 rows or 3 rows up. And then over there.
Thank you. Matthias Wiesuwer, Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung, Germany. I would like to know, first of all, you said there have been some poor countries being the key actors when it comes to the Copenhagen Accord, but the EU obviously was none of those key actors. So what have you learned from, or what are your lessons from the last night in Copenhagen? So what have you learned as a negotiator? Then there was the question how you push some new countries in the EU to do more. I would like to know how you stop some other countries who wants to do much more than the EU, like Germany, for example, is pushing for the 30% target. How you can stop them, and aren't they a danger to the European Union bargaining position in Cancun, for example?
Okay, thank you very much. There was already a long time a hand in the back. Yes, the lady there.
Hi, my name is Shruti and I'm from India. Wanted to know whether, do you think that...
we don't see you. Could you stand up? It would be good so that we can see you.
Do
yes,
you think it is plausible for a country like India, a developing country like India, to reduce its carbon emissions, considering the fact that half of the energy still comes from coal? And what are your expectations from this country?
Okay, good question.
To start with the last one first, no, I do not think that in any foreseeable future it will be plausible for India to reduce its emissions. Not because of sort of the coal in itself there, you could probably, it might be impossible to make it more energy efficient, but because you still have 400 million citizens without access to energy. And of course, that is a very, very basic need that would have to be accommodated before you could sort of ask India to come forward with cuts. That is also why in the international negotiations, nobody is asking real cuts from, for instance, India. The only thing we are discussing from some of the emerging economies at this stage in the short term up to 2020, that is deviation from a business as usual. To try to take care that the growth that you are having, and when you are making new energy plants and things like that, then to do it in the most energy efficient way, not to repeat the mistakes of Europe and others where we did it in a very, very heavy way, fossil-wise. I mean, use the best available technologies, things like that. That is what at stake for India. Nobody would ask India up to 2020 to reduce her emissions, definitely not. Then on Copenhagen, EU was not a key actor, you said. And what did we learn from that? Now, in Copenhagen, I was anything but EU. I was not EU in Copenhagen, so I'm not the right person actually to ask about that, because I was not there, and I also think that a lot of myths have been created around this, sort of as if Europe was not at all present, which of course was not true. But I think that the lesson that Europe as such should learn from Copenhagen is that in the geostrategic new world of the 21st century, Europe will only be listened to as much as the biggest economy in the world deserves to be listened to if Europe manages to speak with one voice. That does not mean that only one can be that voice, but it means that whoever speaks on behalf of Europe, whoever a Chinese minister, or an Indian minister, or a Brazilian minister, or a Mali minister meets from Europe, then they hear more or less the same message. That, I think, should be a lesson learned from Copenhagen, seen from an EU perspective. And then you, as far as I heard you, you said if I would stop Germany from doing more, I think that would always be to work against, almost be to work against my portfolio. I think that it's great. The more countries are doing, the better, and I think that all of us should do the maximum as to what we can do domestically. I understand some of your points about the more tactical things, but I think it's very clear what is the EU position up to Cancun. Now it's very important that in Cancun we present that with one voice. That is what will give the best sort of results for Europe.
Do you want to do a follow-up on that quickly?
Sorry, but the Germans, for example, aren't they a danger for this one voice because they're saying other things than you say? I'm sorry, just to put it directly. But
it's because I think there are two different discussions. There is one discussion: how can we try to make others deliver more? And Europe will be ready to go to 30% if others delivered their fair share. That's one discussion, and I think nobody in Europe would disagree on that. Then there is this other discussion, but what if the rest of the world does not move, or does not move at the international negotiations for a foreseeable future? How are we coping with that domestically in Europe? That's another discussion, that's an internal discussion, and that is not for Cancun. And I mean, now I will not insult journalists, but I know it's always difficult to have some sort of different sort of ways of arguing at the table at once, but it should be possible to have this. There is one which is about the international negotiations, and then there is this one discussion about what will Europe do domestically in our own area, and that is what is at stake here. The final question from Liam from the National Public Radio about sort of the expectations. Just one comment on the build-up of expectations to Copenhagen. First, that started a December day in Bali 2007, when the whole world, in the plenary, a very, very dramatic plenary, in the end agreed to set the deadline Copenhagen 2009 for the international negotiations. First, the US said no, and then for some minutes, the whole thing was a mess in that plenary. And then the US changed its position and was applauded, and everybody agreed. Now we had sort of taken care that there was a deadline for when do we have to make this deal. So the build-up of expectations that Copenhagen would be the deadline, that started 2007 in Bali with all the countries sort of doing this. Did it work? There are many problems when you do that. But can you remember last year? For instance, President Obama mentioned in November sometime that on his way to Oslo to get the Nobel Peace Prize, he would drop by the Copenhagen Climate Conference. I think it was around 10th of December, but a week before all the other leaders arrived. In the end, as you all know, President Obama actually came on the 18th, where the rest of the world was there, and played a very constructive role, and thanks for that. It was just one example of what would not have happened had the expectations not been very strong. In the end, it was not sustainable to say, I will come at another date than the rest of, because the whole world said, now we need to do it. and also a lot of things came out of that. Then you say, do you then now, as far as I understood your question, tactically downplay expectations for Cancun, not just to repeat high expectations? And the short answer could be, I wish it was just tactical. I wish that I, in the back of my pocket, sort of had a much more ambitious agreement, and now you should all sort of know that it's just for tactics, we're downplaying expectations. No, unfortunately, it's not so that the rest of the world is just about to over-fulfilling all your dreams. I wish it was so good. It's not. There is still a lot of hard work to do in order for Cancun to deliver. And we need a lot of hard work to be done in the next few weeks. A lot is at stake. And as I said, and I can conclude that now because I think we have to finish, but I still think that as journalists you also have quite a responsibility in the way that the modern media works. Then it's always difficult when you have big issues like this staying on the agenda for a very long time. And people start to get a bit tired and say, oh, haven't we heard about that, and what is the progress? How can we continue actually to make people understand why this is not just sort of important politically, but it's actually important for all of us and for the kind of life we are going to have among mankind for the next many, many, many decades. So on this more serious note, I would end. Thank you very much for your comments and your questions and your inputs. And I hope you have had some very good days in Brussels, and that at least now you better understand what these strange European bureaucrats and commissioners and everybody else in Brussels, how we are thinking this. So thank you very much for your interest.
Thank you very much indeed.